Common sports injuries and their treatments. Staying active is great, but injuries can happen. Knowing about common sports injuries and treatments can speed up your recovery. Here's a guide: ankle sprain, rest, ice, compression, and elevation, rise can help reduce swelling and pain. Muscle strain, rise and gentle stretching aid healing. Shin splints, reduce activity intensity, stretch calves, and wear supportive shoes. Tennis elbow, rest, ice, pain relief, and physical therapy are key. Remember, seek medical advice if you experience pain. For appointment,